Um, Different stories in the Torah can be challenging because of their lack of detail, because of how ambiguous they are, how difficult they are to understand, because of how little the Torah tells us. And there are other stories that are challenging because of how much detail we're given. And when it comes to this story, of Hashem appearing to Abraham, or the angels appearing to Abraham, we have a lot of detail. There's a lot of concrete detail in this story, and yet, with all of the detail, it's still somewhat of a difficult story to put together. And it starts right at the beginning, right at the very beginning of this story, of the beginning of Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Aleph, chapter 18, verse 1. Again, page 91 in the Steinsaltz, page 78 in the Art Scroll. So, Vayera elav Hashem ve'elonei mamrei. Hashem appears to him in Elonei Mamrei. Vayera elav, we know who it's talking about just based on context, based on, because we know this Parsha. But it's strange that Avram is not identified by name. He's given a pronoun. Vayera elav, Hashem appeared to him Hashem. Some commentators note that the order of the words is a little bit strange. Vayera elav Hashem as opposed to Vayera Hashem elav, which would seem to be a little bit smoother. And he's sitting at the door of his tent at the height of the day, the heat of the day, noontime, when the sun is strongest. We're not sure why he's sitting at his tent, and why it's important that it's the heat of the day. But we know from the famous Midrashim why, because the Midrashim also reflect the ambiguity of all these details. Why are we told when and where he's sitting? So we're from childhood, from second grade, from first grade, we're taught the Midrashim that explain these details. But this entire first pasuk, which is a pretty easy image to conjure in our minds. It's pretty easy to to picture in our minds what it's like, Avram sitting at the door of his tent at the height of the day, but yet the whole scene leaves a lot to be explained. And then it says, and he lifts up his eyes and he sees that three people are standing over him. Vayar, he sees, which is also strange because it's now saying Vayar twice. Vayar v'hinei shlosha anashim. Vayar etzli krasam. Mipesach ha'ohel. Vayishtachu arza, and he bows to them. Vayomar, and he says, Adonai, im namatzah zichem beinecha al nas avor me'al avdecha. Adonai, which it's not clear why Avram says Adonai, and we'll explain about that in a second, but it's also in the singular, right? Here he has three people standing over him, and he speaks in the singular. Beinecha al nasa avor me'al avdecha, right? That's all singular, and yet he's speaking to three people. But of course, the primary, probably the most important question here is to understand what happened from the first pasuk to the second pasuk, because it says in the first pasuk that Hashem appeared to Avraham, but then it doesn't say what Hashem said. Pretty much every other time in the Torah that Hashem appears to someone, it's to deliver a message. It's in order to inform them of something. And here it just says Hashem appeared to Avraham, nothing else. It doesn't say what Hashem said. It reminds me a little bit. It reminds me of in the story of Cain and Hevel, in which it says, that one spoke to the other, right? Where it says that Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv, right? Cain said to Hevel, his brother, And then it says, Vahi biosam basadeh, and they were in the field. And it doesn't say what Cain said to Hevel. It just said, Cain spoke to Hevel, and they were in the field, and Cain kills Hevel. So obviously, Chazal reflect what's missing there. Chazal tell us, what they were fighting about, what they were arguing about, but it's left out of the pasuk. So it says they spoke, and then something happened, but it doesn't tell us what they said. In a similar fashion, we have here, Vayera of Hashem Elohim Arei. Hashem appears to Abraham, and it doesn't go anywhere with that revelation. And so the Rishonim in addressing this issue, they basically break down into three camps how to understand this revelation. One approach, the one that resonates with me most clearly, is that the revelation of Hashem was that Hashem appeared to Avraham as these three angels, as these three men. They're called men here. Later on, they're called angels. That's another detail that's difficult to explain. Why they're called anashim. Later on, they're called malachim. But this is one approach. One approach is to say that Vayera Hashem Elohim Amrei is sort of like a headline pasuk. It's a title, it's an intro, and then the content of that revelation is the next pasuk. Another approach is that no, these are two separate events. Hashem appears to Abraham for whatever reason, and then while Hashem is appearing to Abraham, something else happens, and that is these three messengers come. These, whether they're angels, whether they're men, whether they're actual men, that's another point of discussion. But they're separate. Hashem appears. That's one event, and it has to be explained what it means that Hashem appeared to him, and why the Torah doesn't tell us what the content of that revelation was. But it's a separate and distinct event. The third approach is primarily from the Rambam, who has the very unconventional, I don't know if I should start unconventional, but definitely somewhat controversial approach that this was all a dream, that there weren't actually three visitors, they didn't actually eat, and that this was all a prophetic dream that Hashem gave to Abraham. So the beginning of the dream is Vayera Hashem Elohim Hayom. One of the commentaries say that the reason why it says that it was the heat of the day, it was because he was overcome by the heat. It's like he passed out. It's like Hashem made him go to sleep because of the intense heat, and in that sleep he had this dream, and the dream was Vayisayna Vayar. So that's the third approach. That's the approach of the Rambam. But going back to the second approach, and that is that they're separate events. Hashem appears to Abraham, and then something else happens. The visitors come. So that is something that you see reflected in Chazal when they say that the Achrasas Orchim is so important because even if a person is in the presence of Hashem, they should greet their visitors as Avraham demonstrated. What's most fascinating to me is the comments of the Ramban, and the Ramban has a lot to say about this. But one of the things that stuck out for me, which I wanted to share with you, is that this pasuk of Vayera Elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei v'hu yoshev pesach ha'ohel kachom hayom is a conclusion to the events of last week's Parsha. Last week's Parsha concluded with the Bris Milah, right? That Hashem commands Abraham to circumcise all the men of his household, including Yishmael, and so Abraham does that. Abraham fulfills the commandment of Hashem, and he undergoes Bris Milah for himself. He gives Bris Milah to Yishmael and to all the members of his household, his estate. And so the way the Ramban reads this is that in recognition of Abraham now being entered into the covenant, what we call Bris Shel Avram Avinu, right? The bris that Hashem makes with Abraham, captured in the Bris Milah. Now that Avraham has performed this, so he earns, as it were, a revelation of Hashem. Hashem appears to him in recognition of the fact that he now had Bris Milah. And what that means is that Avram has achieved something in his spiritual path that perhaps he didn't have before, and that perhaps his relationship with Hashem has now grown, has now developed even further, and that Avraham now has merited, now that he has a Bris Milah, he has merited a more intense connection with Hashem. There's this notion that we find in the rabbis in different places that the Bris Milah represents a certain perfection or improvement in the boy, in the child that is given the Bris Milah. And so for Avraham, that improvement, that refinement of having undergone Bris Milah is validated, is recognized by the fact that Hashem appears to him immediately following that. And the Ramban says, don't be bothered by the fact that this pasuk is in the next Parsha, it's in the next Perek. Still, it's a conclusion to the story of the Bris Milah. And then you have this transition after the Bris Milah, after having this revelation of Hashem, then the three visitors come. The only thing I would add to what the Ramban is saying is that, we know in the story of Abraham, we don't really know his early life. We don't know how he came to believe in the one God. What we do know, though, is that he answers a call, he answers a summons, Lech Lecha, and after that summons, Avram comes to the land of Canaan. And what does he do? How does he interact with Hashem? So obviously Hashem has messages for him. Hashem speaks to him. Avram has questions for Hashem. But the spiritual interaction is reflected in the fact that Avram builds altars, right? Mizbachot. Avram builds altars, and he calls in the name of Hashem. That's what we find Avram doing several times. He builds altars and he calls in the name of God. And in fact, the first time he does that, over here in the beginning, it says in Parshas, you don't have to turn back. I'll just read it in the Hebrew and the English. It says, Vayera Hashem el Avram. Hashem appears to Avram. Vayomer l'zaracha aten et zaras hazos. Vayiven sham mizbeach. Right? Avram builds a mizbeach l'Hashem hanir elav, to the God that appeared to him. And then it says in the next pasuk that he traveled and he pitched his tent between Beit El and Ai, and it says Vayiven sham mizbeach l'Hashem vayikra b'shem Hashem, and he builds an altar to Hashem and he calls in the name of Hashem. So what we see from this is that Abraham's gestures towards Hashem is building a mizbeach, calling out in his name, vayikra b'shem Hashem, calling out in the name of God, and recognizing that Hashem has appeared to him, right? Vayiven shal mizbeach l'Hashem hanira elav. He builds a mizbeach to the God that appeared to him, and so now that the Ramban emphasizes that this appearance of Hashem is in recognition of him having Bris Milah, perhaps one could say it's a little bit al derech drush, a little bit homiletical, but if before Avraham had to build a mizbeach to connect with Hashem, now that he has Bris Milah, Avraham by his very self, his person, his body is now able to serve Hashem, right? He will have other opportunities to serve Hashem on a mizbeach, but perhaps he himself has now been elevated in the service of Hashem. And so if in the beginning serving Hashem meant only through a mizbeach, now that he has Bris Milah, now he can serve Hashem with his body, with himself. He has demonstrated a commitment with himself, and so Hashem recognizes that and appears to him to honor and to recognize that now Avraham can serve Hashem in a more intense way with his very self. But going further, it's not just that first two psukim that raise a number of questions, in terms of whether it's one event or two events, but it's also who are these people, right? Right? The approach that resonates with me most is that the revelation of Hashem takes place in the form of these three visitors. They are angels. Again, it's a debate whether they're angels or men, but taking this approach that Vayera of Hashem means that these three people appear, that is the revelation of Hashem. So then you really have to explain so much about what's going on here. If these are angels, how are they eating? Why are they washing their feet? It may seem easy to explain and say, like, this was all just pretend, but there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of discussion in the Rishonim how to understand the actions of these three men and how Avram treats them. Some say that the angels they took the form of men, and Avram therefore treated them like men. There's a discussion whether Avram even knew that they were angels or not. Some say that Avram didn't know they were angels at first, which is why he serves them food, and only later does he then find out that they are in fact angels. They are messengers of Hashem. But that's also something that's difficult in order to difficult to understand. Again, the other thing I want to go back to, as like I began, is how much detail exists in this story, and yet it's still difficult to understand. There are many verbs. There are many verbs. There is a lot of action going on in this story, and that adds to the detail. If we were to just count how many verbs we encounter in the first several psukim, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, it starts with Vayera. That's Hashem. V'hu yoshev, he's sitting. So that's Avram. Vayisa einav, he lifts up his eyes. Vayar, and he sees. Vayar, vayaratz, he goes to runs them. Vayishtachu, he bows down. Vayomar, he says, Adonai v'nam tzasichein al nasa avor me'al avdecha yukachna ma'at mayim v'rachatzu raglechem v'yishnu tachas ha'etz v'lekcha, I will take pas lechem. That's 10 verbs I'm counting. V'sa'adu libchem achar tavoru ki alkin v'al avdechem vayomru kein tasek asher dibarta vayimaher Avraham ha'ohela, he hastens to the tent. Vayomer, and he says to Sarah, that's 12. Mahari, he says to her, fast, make shlosh se'im kenachsos lushi v'asiyugos, that's 13 and 14. Velabakar ruts Avraham runs to the bakar, that's 15. Vayikach ben bakar rachoto vayitain elanar vayimaher lasos, so that's another 3. We're up to 18. Vayikach chema v'chalav ben bakar so vayitain lifnehem, that's another 2. We're up to 20. And he stands over them. That's 21, and that's not even an accurate count. That you could even add a few more. But here you have, in this first section, you have so much activity, so much hustle that Avraham demonstrates. It adds so much color, so much detail to the story, and yet we're not even sure who he's talking to. The Torah doesn't even make it very clear that these are angels or these are men. Again, there are very good arguments in favor of either. For instance, when Avram says in Pasuk Gimel Vayomar, and he says Adonai, right? So that seems to be Shem Hashem. As I mentioned before, it's in the singular. Some argue that Avraham knows this is a revelation of Hashem, and that these 3 men are really a revelation, a manifestation of Hashem. Avram is very cognizant of that, and so that's why he says Adonai. He's addressing Hashem, and that's why it's in the singular, because he's addressing the one God. But again, it's not so clear, especially because later on in the story, Hashem does speak using the traditional Yud Ke Vav Ke. Right, in Pasuk Yud Gimel, in verse 13, it says, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, lama zet tzachaka Sarah. Right, all of a sudden, right, Hashem speaks up. And if you think that these are visitors, and it's a separate event from what, from Hashem appearing to Avraham, all of a sudden, Hashem interrupts into this story where we didn't realize he was there before. Again, that's if you take the approach that Avram did not know who he was talking to. But if you take the approach that he did, so it's not so surprising, right? Avram knows it's Hashem. He addresses the angels as Hashem in the singular, and so when Hashem speaks up with the 4-letter name in Pasuk Yud Gimel, it's not so surprising. Some argue that it's only in the middle that Abraham realizes that these are angels. When is it? When they start speaking prophetically, right? What I read to you so far in the first 8 verses is all Abraham's activity in feeding them. And then, Vayomru Elav, and then they say to him, Aye Sarah Ishtecha. Where is Sarah, your wife? Vayomer Hinei Ba'ohel. Vayomer Shova Shuv Elecha Kais Chayav Hinei Vein LeSarah Ishtecha. Which, notice that this is in the singular, right? I will return to you in a year, and Sarah will have a child. So according to some, that's when Avraham realizes that he's in the presence of Hashem, or these are angels of Hashem. But what's interesting to me is this Vayomru Elav, and there are dots over the Elav. And Chazal talk about why there are these dots over Elav. But to me, this Elav caught my attention because the Parsha begins Vayera Elav Hashem Elonei Mamre, and the use of a love again, Vayomru a love Aye Sarah Ishtecha, I think is noteworthy, right? The fact that it's used at the beginning of the parsha and now here when the prophecy begins, to me that link, right? That usage of the fact that of the pronoun, which a love is a more intense form of lo, right? It could have said Vayera lo Hashem, or Vayera Hashem lo. A love to him seems to convey a more intense feel, a more intense engagement, and so perhaps the Vayera love Hashem Elonei Mamre at the beginning is coming to set the tone for this prophecy. For this revelation, for what Hashem informs Abraham at this point, namely that the prophecy that he will have a son will actually come true, and he tells him when it will happen. And again, just thinking about what we said before, that this is post Bris Milah, in which Avram's relationship with Hashem has now intensified. So I think that a love conveys that idea, it reflects that sense that Avram is now has a more intense relationship with Hashem, and things are now going to get more serious. Now he's going to have a son, and other things are going to go on as well. And so the Torah then explains to us something we already know in Pasuk Yud Beis, Pasuk Yud Aleph. This seems to be the narrator speaking. Avram and Sarah are old. Sarah no longer is able of having a child. And then we have this very strange exchange in which Sarah laughs and then denies that she laughs. We don't even know why that's an issue, right? The Chazal struggle with this. Is Sarah demonstrating a lack of faith? Or is she just the opposite? Is she highlighting the miraculous nature of what's going on? But what's interesting is that Hashem speaks to Avram here very clearly. Vayomer Hashem, not a love, Vayomer love, not Vayomer love, Vayomer Hashem El Avram Lama Zet Tzachaka Sarah Lemor Ha'afum Nami Leid Vani Zakanti. Right? Why did Sarah laugh, saying that I'm too old for this? Hayipoleme Hashem Davar, is Hashem not capable? Lamoedo Shuvilecha Keis Chayolu Sarah Vein. right? I will return, and Sarah will have a child. Vatichachesh Sarah lemor lo tzachakti ki yareh vayomer lo ki tzachakt. And there's a debate who's speaking at this point, because Sarah denies that she laughed, and then it says, and he said, no, you laughed, which either could be Avraham speaking, or it could be Hashem speaking. I don't want to focus on this part, because in seeing this episode as reflecting the intensifying of the connection or the relationship between Hashem and Avraham, I want to highlight something that Nechama Leibowitz pointed out, that I saw this year for the first time, and that is, if you look at the whole story that begins with Hashem appearing to Avraham and concludes with the destruction of Sodom. If you look at that whole story and how it plays out, so there seems to be a middle section in which Hashem talks to himself, which divides between the first part and the second part. What do I mean? So if you take a look at Pasuk Yud Zayin, verse 17, I'm on page 93 in the Steinsaltz and page 80 in the Art Scroll. So at that point where we left off, right, where we just talked about how Sarah laughed and someone says, no, you did laugh. So then all of a sudden it says, Vayikumu misham ha'anashim. So let's just back up to Pasuk Des Zayin, verse 16. Right? So Vayikumu misham ha'anashim v'yashkifu al pnei Sodom. So the prophecy about Yitzchak is over, and now we turn to Sodom. Right? The Anashim, the people, the men, the angels, whoever they are, they get up and they look out at Sodom. V'Avraham holech imam l'shalacham. And Avram is walking with them to escort them. And all of a sudden, in Pasuk Yud Zayin, it says, Vashem Omar. Hashem says to himself, Hamechaseh ani me Avraham asher ani oseh. Am I going to withhold from Avraham what I am about to do? The Avraham hayo yiyeh legoy gadol ve'atzum. Avraham is going to be a great and mighty nation. V'nivruchu vo kol goy haaretz. All the other nations will be blessed through him. Ki yidativ. For I have appointed him. And there's a lot of different ways you can understand this phrase according to various commentaries. Ki yidativ. The way I'm explaining it is just one approach of many. Ki yidativ. For I have appointed him. L'man asher yitzaveh banav es v'yisalach harav v'shamru derech Hashem. That he should command his children and his household after him that they should keep the path of Hashem. Lasos tzedakah mishpat. To perform righteousness and justice, Laman havi Hashem al Avram Esa Shirdiber love, so that I can bring upon Avram, so I Hashem can bring upon Avraham what I'm going to, what I had spoken about him. Vayomer Hashem, and then it says Vayomer Hashem. Hashem says, Zakasidon v'amaraki rabba v'chatason ki chavdam ba'od, which implies that Hashem is now speaking to Avraham. Right? Hashem says that I've heard the cry of Stom and Amorah, and I'm going to look at it. Erdana v'ereh haketzaka sahaba elai asukala v'imlo edah. Right? I will descend now and see if they've acted in accordance with the outcry that has reached me, and I will bring destruction upon them. And if not, I will know. And then it says, "Vayifnu misham anashim ve'elchu Sodom v'Avram odenu yumeid lifnei Hashem." And so the men, they turn away and they go towards Sodom, and Avram is still standing before Hashem. The fact that it says Avram is still standing before Hashem is another proof that's used to indicate that this whole scene was a revelation of Hashem. Vayigash Avraham vayomar, and Avraham draws near and he says, Ha'afti spet tzadikim rasha. He begins to argue and advocate on behalf of Sodom. So Nechama Leibowitz looks at verses 17 through 21, right? Vashem Omar Hamechaseh Ani Me Avraham, through Vayomer Hashem Zakah Sodom V'Amorah, as sort of like an interlude, or a central pivot from which the whole story turns, right? At first, you have a revelation of Hashem and to deliver certain messages, and then you have all of a sudden Hashem thinking to himself, and then you have the rest of the story. And the rest of the story is Avraham arguing on behalf of Sodom. And so this section, this interlude in which Hashem is talking to himself, is thinking to himself, is noteworthy, because it turns the story in the direction of now, the way I see it is that the relationship between Avraham and Hashem is continuing to intensify and continuing to get closer. Because now Avraham is someone who is able to argue with Hashem, someone who is able to challenge Hashem. And if he had done that without this introduction of what Hashem was thinking, I might not understand it. I might not understand the true depth of what's going on here. But this interlude, these 4 or 5 psukim, they tell us something about Avraham that we didn't really know as clearly as we do now. We know that Hashem makes a covenant with Avraham. We know that Hashem has done the bris bein habesarim, has done the covenant between the pieces. We know that Hashem has done the bris milah, the covenant of circumcision with Avraham, and we've seen how Avraham's relationship with Hashem has grown. But what we see now, in the midst of this revelation, now that Hashem thinks, out loud to himself, what he does is describe in much more clear terms what Avram's destiny is going to be. Right? We know that Avram is going to be a great nation. We know that Hashem is going to give him this land. We know that Hashem wants all nations blessed through Avraham. But this is the first time we're told, Ki yadativ, I have appointed him, I have designated Avraham as someone whose descendants are going to keep my path and uphold tzedakah and mishpat. To me, this, the Torah is painting a picture of Avraham, and this is the part of the picture that brings it all together, right? We have the bris bein habesarim, we have the bris milah, but here we now really get the true import of the covenants that Hashem is making with Avraham. Now we get the real significance of the real destiny that Hashem has in store, right? We know Avram's children are going to be slaves in Egypt. We know Hashem's going to redeem them and bring them back to this land and give it to them. But what's that all about? What's the point of all that? What's the goal of all that? That we don't find out until this moment, until this again. First you have the prophecies. You have the prophecy of that Yitzchak will be born in a year's time, and then right before we get to Sodom, and we see Avraham arguing and advocating on behalf of Sodom, the last piece of the picture, as it were, is filled in of what Hashem has in store for Avraham and his descendants. Right? Now that we know that when Yitzchak is going to be born, now that we know where Avram's household will emerge from, it'll emerge from Yitzchak. Right? Now we are told what Hashem really has in store for Avraham. And what Hashem really has in store for Avraham is Shamru Derech Hashem and Lasos Tzedakah Umishpat. That is Hashem's ultimate goal for Avram and Sarah and their descendants. And so this story has this interlude here, which spells out for us very clearly who Avram is, what he's going to represent, and what he and his descendants are going to accomplish. When you think about, the general expectations that the Torah has for the Jewish people, for the Bnei Israel, as it plays out, in the rest of the Torah, as we see it in the Nevi'im, so the expectation is that they will keep the Torah and that they will advance the values of the Torah. That's the mission of the Jewish people. That is our destiny, and that destiny is realized in the context of a story, of a historical destiny that is going to conclude with the coming of the Mashiach and the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Right? When those things happen, we will be in our most ideal state for advancing that mission of Vishamru Derech Hashem and La'asot Tzedakah Mishpat. But that's always our mission, whether we have a Beis HaMikdash or not. But that mission is best realized in that context. And so what we are told here that that Abraham's descendants will Shamru Derech Hashem and La'asot Tzedakah Mishpat. So that is something that we see, spelled out in the rest of the Torah and the Nevi'im, right? I've spoken many times about how the Nevi'im distill the primary values that we are supposed to aspire to, and over and again, the Nevi'im talk about tzedek and mishpat, righteousness and justice, caring for people, ensuring that everyone has opportunities to thrive in the context of tzedakah and mishpat. What the Nevi'im envision in the end of days of a return of justice and righteousness, that whole story begins right here. That whole story of the ultimate destiny that Hashem has for the Jewish people and the entire world, it begins right here. And it's spelled out most clearly right here in the middle of this story, in the middle of this vision, as it were, of the angels visiting Avram after he gets Bris Milah. So again, not to repeat myself too much or belabor the point, but basically what you have here is in Parshas Lech Lecha, Hashem makes a bris, Hashem makes a covenant with Avraham through the Bris Bein Abasarim, through Bris Milah. Now Avraham has this more intense connection with Hashem, and in the context of this intense connection with Hashem, Hashem lays out the last piece in the puzzle, in the covenant, in the mission that he has for Avram and his descendants, which is this interlude of the verses 17 through 21. And so now that we know this, now that we see the true ultimate destiny and mission of Avram and his children, of Vishamru Derech Hashem La'asot Tzedakah Mishpat, to see that play out in the context of Sodom is so powerful. To see how Avraham argues on behalf of Sodom by referencing what Hashem is supposed to do, not what Avraham is supposed to do. Avraham sees, perceives, understands the nature of Hashem as Hashofet Kol Haaretz. And he challenges Hashem, Hashofet Kol Haaretz Lo Yaseh Mishpat, in verse 25. Avram says this to Hashem. Right? Just a few moments ago, Hashem said, I appoint Avraham, he's going to be the one to carry out tzedakah umishpat. And Avram does it immediately. Avraham demonstrates tzedakah and mishpat immediately. Right? This is, I could almost see this as a test, right? The Akedah is the ultimate test. But Sodom and Amorah is a test for Avraham. And Avram demonstrates exactly what Hashem has in store for Avram and his descendants. That tzedakah and mishpat, Avram articulates it beautifully, to the extent that Avram takes advantage of the close and intense relationship that he has with Hashem to brazenly say, Hashofet Kol Haaretz Lo Yaseh Mishpat. Look how close Avram feels to Hashem, and look how much Avram recognizes what Hashem expects from him. Hashem expects him to uphold tzedakah and mishpat. Avram understands that to the degree that Avram feels like he can throw it back at Hashem, kaviyachol, as it were. Hashofet kol aretz lo yaseh mishpat. It's amazing. It's amazing to see, the promise that Avram's descendants will be slaves and they'll be redeemed. That's going to take a long time to play out. But the fact that Hashem expects Avram to hold tzedakah and mishpat, we see that immediately. It's right there. And it's there in the most difficult of circumstances. Because Hashem doesn't present a scenario for Hashem does not present a scenario for Abraham where innocent people are being taken advantage of. It's not Avram is not advocating on behalf of the innocent. Avram is advocating on behalf of the guilty, the wicked people of Sodom and Amorah, and still Avraham wants to pursue as much as possible the notion of mishpat, the notion of tzedek. Ha'af tispet tzadikim rasha. It's so dramatic, and what Nechama Leibowitz highlighted for me is how that interlude of those 5 psukim that Vashem Marham Chaseh Ani Me Avraham really sets the stage for the rest of the story, and how it reflects both the intensified relationship that Avram now has with Hashem, and how Avram perceives, intuits, understands, knows his true mission in this world. And so that's, again, we know how the story plays out. Hashem ultimately destroys Sodom and Amorah, and yet it is still Avram's finest hour. We see Hashem's divine justice, Hashem's divine wrath play out in the way that it's supposed to, and yet it's still an opportunity for Avraham to demonstrate his commitment to tzedakah and mishpat, and how to test the limits of that, and how to see the extent to which it should be applied. So Parshas Vayera, again, as I said, when I began this class, it has so much, rich in detail, but so much to understand beneath all of that detail. All right, thanks for joining today. Have a great week, everybody. Nice to see everyone.